On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Constance Ryland sits on her porch with a cup of tea, expecting no one, owing no one an explanation for her time, her money, or her opinions. It took her the better part of a decade to build the life that makes this ordinary afternoon possible. This is the story of the 5 boundaries that got her here. The tea is still warm. The afternoon light is doing that particular soft, golden thing it does in early autumn in Michigan, and Constance's phone sits quietly on the small table beside her, undisturbed, not because her family has stopped needing her, but because she has spent the past several years teaching everyone around her, gently and consistently, exactly what kind of availability she is actually offering and on what terms. This is her story. Constance is 66, divorced for 12 years, retired for 3 after spending 28 years as a human resources manager at a manufacturing plant in a small Michigan town. She has 2 adult children, Patrick, 39, and Nicole, 35, and 4 grandchildren she adores. Her career in human resources, she often points out with a wry smile, gave her decades of practice mediating exactly the kind of conflicts that arise when people's needs and expectations quietly diverge without anyone naming it directly, disputes between coworkers who had simply never discussed their actual working boundaries, managers who had let responsibilities creep unchecked until resentment set in on both sides. She spent an entire career helping other people build structure around their professional relationships. It took her considerably longer, she admits, to apply that same clear thinking to her own family. This is not a story about a single crisis or a single dramatic turning point. It is the story of 5 separate lessons learned slowly and sometimes painfully over the past several years that together built the calm, sustainable family life Constance now enjoys. The first boundary Constance ever had to learn concerned her time with her grandchildren, and it grew out of a period she now describes candidly as the year she nearly disappeared entirely into unpaid, unlimited child care. When Nicole's first child was born 6 years ago, Constance was overjoyed to help however she could, and initially offered to watch the baby 1 day a week while Nicole returned to work part-time. That single day, however, quietly expanded first to 2 days. Then, as Nicole's work schedule shifted and her second and third children arrived, to nearly 4 full days most weeks, along with regular last-minute requests whenever something came up. Constance remembers with particular clarity the week she realized she had completely missed her own book club 3 months running, had let her weekly walking group lapse entirely, and had, without ever quite deciding to, structured her entire retirement around being perpetually available for childcare she had never actually agreed to at that scale. She remembers, too, a specific Tuesday afternoon that crystallized the problem for her more than any other single moment. Standing in Nicole's kitchen at nearly 6 in the evening, exhausted after an unplanned full day with all 3 grandchildren, realizing she had eaten nothing since breakfast and had missed a doctor's appointment of her own that morning entirely, having simply forgotten it existed under the weight of the day's child care demands. She sat in her car afterward in Nicole's driveway for several minutes before driving home, doing an uncomfortable inventory of just how completely her own life had been absorbed into a role she never remembered formally agreeing to take on at this scale. I love my grandchildren more than almost anything in this world, Constance told her longtime friend Rosa, a retired therapist, over coffee one particularly exhausted afternoon. But I retired to have a life of my own, too, and somewhere along the way I stopped having one. Rosa, who had spent decades helping others name exactly this kind of quiet, well-intentioned erosion, asked Constance a simple question that stuck with her for weeks afterward. Constance, did you ever actually agree to 4 days a week? Or did it just happen gradually enough that nobody, including you, ever formally decided it? Constance sat with that question for a long time and eventually had a direct, calm conversation with Nicole, proposing a specific, sustainable arrangement instead. 2 set days each week, agreed upon in advance with the clear understanding that anything beyond that would require asking rather than assuming. Nicole, to her credit, was more receptive than Constance had feared, admitting that she, too, had simply assumed the arrangement worked fine for her mother, having never actually stopped to ask directly. The two of them spent an evening working out the specifics together, settling on Tuesdays and Thursdays as Constance's regular grandchild days, with the shared understanding that any additional request would come as an actual question, with real room for Constance to say no without needing to justify it extensively. Today that boundary holds steadily. On this particular Sunday, Constance's phone buzzes with a text from Nicole asking if she might be free Wednesday afternoon for a few hours, an actual question rather than an assumption, which Constance is free to answer honestly, without guilt, whichever way suits her that particular week. The difference, Constance often tells Rosa now, is that helping is a gift I choose to give instead of a debt I'm constantly paying off. The second boundary concerned money, and it grew out of an experience considerably more painful than the child care situation, one that came uncomfortably close to jeopardizing Constance's own financial security. 7 years ago, Patrick came to her in genuine distress, needing several $1,000s to cover a gap between jobs during a difficult stretch of unemployment. Constance, moved by her son's obvious anxiety and eager to help however she could, transferred the money quickly, with no written agreement, no specific repayment timeline, simply a verbal promise that he would pay her back once he was back on his feet. 2 years passed. Patrick made only sporadic, partial payments, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation for the delay, until Constance, reviewing her own retirement projections with a financial advisor, discovered that the unpaid loan had quietly become a real threat to her own long-term security, a fact she had been avoiding, examining directly out of a mixture of embarrassment and reluctance to damage her relationship with her son. She remembers sitting across from her financial advisor, watching him run the numbers with the outstanding loan factored in versus without it, and feeling a genuine chill at how significant the difference actually was to her own retirement timeline. She had told herself for 2 years that it was simply a temporary gap, a small favor between mother and son that would sort itself out eventually. The spreadsheet in front of her told a considerably less comfortable story. That experience taught Constance something she has never forgotten since, that generosity without structure isn't actually generosity toward anyone, including the person receiving it. It is simply an invitation for confusion and eventually resentment on both sides. Today, Constance maintains a clear, calmly communicated financial boundary with both of her children. She sets aside a specific modest amount each year that she is willing to consider offering as help, discussed openly in advance rather than decided reactively in the heat of an urgent request. Any amount beyond that requires an actual conversation, ideally with some kind of written understanding, rather than a quick answer given under emotional pressure. When Patrick called last month, mentioning an unexpected car repair, Constance calmly reminded him of this year's remaining amount in their agreed arrangement, and the conversation, rather than becoming tense or awkward, simply proceeded as a normal, practical discussion between two adults who both understood the terms clearly in advance. Patrick, for his part, has come to genuinely appreciate the clarity, telling his mother more than once that knowing exactly where the boundary sits actually makes it easier for him to ask when he truly needs help, rather than agonizing over whether a request might be unreasonable or overwhelming. The old loan eventually was fully repaid as well, once Constance finally sat Patrick down and formalized a real schedule rather than continuing to let it drift along informally. The third boundary concerned unsolicited opinions, and it grew out of what Constance now recognizes as one of the most damaging periods in her relationship with her daughter. For nearly 2 years after Nicole's first child was born, Constance found herself commenting frequently and often critically on Nicole's parenting choices, the baby's sleep schedule, her approach to discipline, decisions about school and extracurricular activities that Constance felt, based on her own considerable experience raising 2 children, could clearly be handled better. Constance genuinely believed at the time that she was simply offering the benefit of decades of hard-won parenting experience, sparing Nicole from mistakes she herself had already learned from the hard way. It didn't occur to her in the moment that parenting philosophies had shifted considerably in the years since she'd raised her own children, or that Nicole might have entirely valid reasons for making different choices than the ones Constance would have made. The tension eventually reached a breaking point during a difficult holiday visit, when Nicole, in tears, told her mother directly that she had started dreading Constance's visits because they had come to feel less like connection and more like ongoing evaluation. "Mom, I know you mean well, but I need you to trust that I'm capable of raising my own children, even when I do it differently than you would have," Nicole said, her voice trembling with an exhaustion that had clearly been building for a long time. Constance remembers the particular sting of that conversation, not because Nicole was being unfair, but because some part of her recognized, immediately and uncomfortably, that her daughter was entirely right. She thought back over months of visits, replaying comments she had made almost automatically, without any real malice, but also without any real invitation, and understood, for the first time, how exhausting it must have been to receive that steady stream of unsolicited correction from someone she loved and wanted to feel close to. That conversation, though painful to hear in the moment, became one of the most important turning points in Constance's approach to her entire family. She began practicing deliberately and with real effort at first A simple new rule for herself, waiting to be asked before offering an opinion on any major decision in her adult children's lives, whether about parenting, marriage, or career. The early months of this new practice were, by Constance's own admission, genuinely difficult. She recalls physically biting her tongue on several occasions, watching Nicole make a parenting choice she privately disagreed with, forcing herself to simply observe rather than comment. It felt at first almost like abandoning her role as a mother entirely. Over time, though, the restraint became less effortful and eventually almost natural. Today, that restraint has become almost second nature, and the relationship with Nicole has transformed considerably as a result. When Nicole mentioned during a recent visit that she was considering a new approach to bedtime with her youngest, Constance simply listened, nodding with genuine interest, offering no opinion at all unless Nicole specifically turned to her and asked, "What do you think, Mom?" Cussed. At which point, and only then, Constance offered her thoughts, briefly and without insistence. "I used to think staying quiet meant not caring," Constance reflects now. "It actually means caring enough to let her be the mother she's choosing to be, instead of the mother I would have been." The fourth boundary concerned privacy and physical space, and it grew out of a period when Constance's own home had gradually stopped feeling entirely like her own. During the early years after her divorce, both Patrick and Nicole, along with various grandchildren, developed a habit of dropping by unannounced, sometimes multiple times a week, treating Constance's house as a natural extension of their own, raiding her refrigerator, letting themselves in through the back door, occasionally arriving while Constance was still in her bathrobe on a lazy Saturday morning she had specifically planned to spend alone. Constance understood, looking back, part of where the habit originated. In the years right after the divorce, both children had checked in on her frequently and without much notice, worried about how she was adjusting to living alone after nearly 3 decades of marriage, and she had welcomed those spontaneous visits gratefully at the time, glad for the company during a genuinely difficult adjustment. The trouble was that the habit never adjusted once she was, in fact, doing quite well again, settling comfortably into her own independent rhythms, and increasingly craving some uninterrupted time of her own. Constance remembers with a small, rueful laugh now the particular afternoon that finally pushed her to address the pattern directly. Patrick's family arriving unannounced during the one afternoon she had blocked off specifically to finish a large jigsaw puzzle she'd been working on for weeks, scattering pieces everywhere within minutes of their arrival. She called a simple family meeting shortly afterward and proposed a straightforward new rule: a text message before any visit, even a quick one, giving her the chance to say yes, or occasionally, simply and without extensive justification, "Not today." The rule met with some initial grumbling, particularly from Patrick's wife Diane, who felt at first that the new formality signaled some kind of unwelcome distance in the family. Diane mentioned somewhat pointedly during that first family meeting that her own mother had always welcomed drop-in visits without any advance warning, and worried aloud that Constance's new rule meant something had shifted in how welcome the family actually felt in her home. But within a few months, even Diane had come to appreciate the clarity of it, admitting to Constance eventually that she preferred always feeling genuinely welcome during a planned visit rather than occasionally sensing correctly that she'd arrived at an inconvenient moment. Diane, in fact, became one of the rule's most consistent practitioners, often sending Constance a thoughtful text well in advance, sometimes including a small joke about what mischief the grandchildren might get up to, turning what began as a slightly tense new boundary into its own small ritual of connection. Today, that simple text-first rule holds reliably across the entire family, and Constance's home has returned fully to being exactly what it should always have been, genuinely, entirely hers, shared generously and by her own choice, rather than assumed and taken for granted. The fifth and final boundary concerned something considerably less tangible than time, money, or physical space. Constance's own emotional bandwidth and her gradual realization that she had become, without ever intending to, the designated emotional first responder for nearly everyone in her extended family. Patrick called her with every work frustration. Nicole called her with every marital disagreement. Even her former daughter-in-law occasionally called with complaints about Patrick that Constance had no idea how to appropriately handle. Constance found herself absorbing an enormous, constant volume of other people's unprocessed emotions, with remarkably little space left over to process her own grief, her own adjustment to divorce and retirement, her own ordinary, difficult days. She remembers a particular week, roughly 4 years ago, when she fielded emotionally intense calls from Patrick about a workplace conflict, from Nicole about tension with her husband, and even from Diane, who called separately with her own frustrations about Patrick, all within the space of a single week, while Constance herself was quietly struggling with the first anniversary of her divorce becoming final, a difficult milestone she never found a single spare moment to actually sit with amid everyone else's demands on her attention. It was Rosa, once again, who helped Constance see the pattern clearly and name it directly. Constance, you spent 28 years professionally managing other people's workplace conflicts. I think you've been doing the exact same job at home, unpaid, without anyone ever formally asking you to. That observation landed with particular force. Constance realized, turning it over in the following days, that she had never actually questioned whether serving as everyone's emotional landing pad was a role she wanted, simply because it was a role she happened to be naturally good at from decades of professional practice. Being good at something, she came to understand, was not the same thing as being obligated to do it indefinitely for free at the expense of her own emotional well-being. Constance began practicing a gentle but consistent redirection whenever family members brought her problems that weren't really hers to solve. That sounds like something worth bringing up directly with your husband, rather than working through with me, she'd say to Nicole, warmly but firmly. Have you thought about talking to someone professionally about that particular stress at work? She'd suggest to Patrick, rather than simply absorbing the frustration herself every single time. The redirection wasn't about closing herself off from her children's struggles entirely. It was about recognizing which problems were genuinely hers to help carry, and which ones needed to be worked through elsewhere by the people actually equipped and responsible for solving them. She also began, deliberately, building her own outlets for processing her own emotional life. A standing weekly appointment with a therapist Rosa had recommended, a renewed commitment to her own book club, long phone calls with Rosa herself that went both directions, rather than existing solely to process everyone else's problems. Today, when Patrick calls, sounding stressed about a work situation, Constance listens with real warmth for a few minutes, then gently asks what he thinks his own next step might be, rather than automatically absorbing the entire emotional weight of the problem herself. More often than not, he arrives at his own answer within the conversation, having simply needed a caring, attentive ear, rather than a solution delivered on his behalf. Sitting on her porch this particular Sunday afternoon, Constance reflects on how each of these 5 boundaries emerged from a specific, sometimes painful lesson, and how, together, they built the calm, sustainable family life she now enjoys. None of these boundaries pushed her family away. If anything, each one, once properly established, brought everyone closer, replacing quiet resentment and gradual exhaustion with something considerably more honest and considerably more sustainable. Nicole visits more often now, not less, precisely because those visits no longer carry the weight of unspoken evaluation. Patrick calls with genuine affection rather than only during moments of financial need, because the financial relationship between them finally has clear, comfortable structure. Diane, once resistant to the visiting rule, now sends Constance the warmest, most detailed texts before every visit, treating the small courtesy as an opportunity for connection rather than an obstacle. Constance has noticed, too, a subtler shift she hadn't fully anticipated when she began establishing these boundaries. Her grandchildren themselves seem to sense the difference in her energy during their time together. The 2 set days each week are no longer marked by the low-grade exhaustion that used to color even her happiest moments with them. She finds herself more patient, more genuinely present, more able to enjoy an afternoon of coloring books and made-up games, precisely because that afternoon exists inside a structure she chose, rather than a demand she simply absorbed. "I used to think boundaries meant building walls," Constance told Rosa recently, during their now regular Sunday evening phone call. "I understand now that they're actually more like building doors. A door can be opened generously, by choice, again and again. A house with no doors at all, just open walls everyone walks through whenever they want, isn't hospitality. It's just exhaustion dressed up as love." Rosa laughed at that, telling Constance she ought to write it down somewhere, that after decades of listening to other people's family struggles professionally, she'd rarely heard anyone put the distinction quite that clearly. The 2 women had met over a decade earlier in a community gardening class neither of them had particularly needed, but had both signed up for anyway in the restless early months following Constance's divorce. Rosa's own 3 decades of clinical practice, treating patients navigating exactly the kind of family entanglements Constance would later find herself untangling, had made her an unusually perceptive friend, someone who asked the right question at the right moment rather than simply offering sympathy, someone whose gentle observations tended to lodge themselves in Constance's mind for weeks until she was finally ready to act on them. Constance often says now that she couldn't have found her way to any of these 5 boundaries without Rosa's steady, patient presence beside her throughout the entire process. Constance's story is worth telling because these 5 boundaries, though deeply personal in their origin, follow a pattern recognizable in nearly every family navigating the years after 60. Here they are plainly for anyone building their own version of the same sustainable, loving structure. Set a clear boundary around your time and availability with grandchildren. Helping should remain a genuine choice you make freely, again and again, not an unspoken, unlimited obligation that quietly consumes your entire retirement. Establish a specific, communicated financial limit, decided calmly in advance, rather than under the pressure of an urgent request in the moment. Structure protects both you and the people you're helping far more reliably than open-ended generosity ever can. Wait to be asked before offering your opinion on your adult children's major life decisions, their parenting, their marriages, their careers. This single restraint protects the relationship far more effectively than even the wisest unsolicited advice ever could. Establish clear expectations around privacy and advance notice for visits to your home. Your house remains genuinely yours, to be shared generously by your own choice, not assumed as a constant, open extension of everyone else's life. And recognize that you are not obligated to serve as the emotional first responder for your entire extended family. Gently redirecting a problem that isn't yours to solve is an act of real care, not a failure of love. None of these 5 boundaries arrived easily, and Constance is quick to point that out to anyone tempted to think her current calm simply came naturally to her. Each one required an uncomfortable conversation she would have preferred to avoid, a period of adjustment that felt, at the time, like it might damage the relationship rather than strengthen it, and a willingness to tolerate some initial pushback without immediately retreating back into the old, exhausting pattern. The discomfort in every single case turned out to be temporary. The resentment she had been quietly accumulating before each boundary, by contrast, had no natural end point at all. It would simply have continued building indefinitely, corroding the very relationships she was trying so hard to protect through constant, unstructured availability. Constance finishes her tea as the afternoon light softens in a house that is entirely hers, in a family relationship that has grown steadily warmer rather than more distant across each of these 5 hard-won boundaries. Which of these 5 boundaries do you already have in place? Which one do you still need to set? Tell us in the comments below, and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else, quietly exhausted by exactly the pattern Constance once lived inside, might need to read your answer today. If Constance's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity years, because the families that last aren't the ones without boundaries. They're the ones who learned, eventually, that boundaries were what allowed the love to keep going.